The echo in the mirror wears my father's face. My name is Elias Thorne, and I have been a conservator of fine antiques for 27 years. In that time, you learn that every object has a history, but history is just a sequence of chemical reactions. Rust, decay, and patina, not a ghost story waiting to be told. The Barrow mirror, however, taught me that some objects don't just decay, they remember, and they hunger. In my profession, one must maintain a scrupulous separation between sentiment and material fact. For 27 years, my workshop has been a laboratory dedicated to this principle, a place where the chaotic passions of history are neutralized by chemistry and physics. The air here doesn't smell of old books and ghosts, as my clients seem to hope. It smells of ethanol, mineral spirits, and archival-grade adhesives. Temperature and humidity are kept within a precise, unforgiving range. It is a space designed to halt time, to stabilize the processes of decay that people so often mistake for a lingering presence. I am a conservator, not a medium. My job is to diagnose the afflictions of objects, the brittleness of desiccated wood, the bloom on old varnish, the subtle corrosion caused by a century of human touch. A client might hand me a writing desk and speak of the heartbroken poet who owned it, but I see only the ink stains, the pattern of stress fractures in the legs, and the specific species of woodworm that bored through the drawers. The poet's sorrow is irrelevant. The pH of his ink is not. This worldview is not cynicism, but a necessary professional discipline. You cannot properly consolidate a flaking oil painting if you are preoccupied with the artist's tormented soul. You must focus on the binder, the pigment, and the canvas. This is why I have always dismissed the notion of haunted objects as a category error, a failure to observe the world with sufficient rigor. The creak of an old chair is not a spirit stirring. It is a sign of joint failure due to changes in atmospheric moisture. A cold spot in a room is a draft, not a phantom. Every supposed supernatural phenomenon I have ever encountered in an antique has had a clear, material explanation. To me, history is simply a physical problem to be solved, not a spirit to be appeased. The commission came from the solicitors handling the Barrow estate, a name I knew only by its reputation for litigation and decay. The house had stood empty for decades, a monument to entropy, and the collection was in the state one would expect. Silver tarnished black, wood riddled with beetle larvae, fabrics returning to dust. My task was to assess and salvage what was viable. Most of it was a write-off. But in the center of the main drawing room, shrouded in a yellowed sheet, was the centerpiece. It was a pier glass mirror, enormous and imposing, with a silver gilt frame of grotesque, serpentine acanthus leaves. The style was late Victorian, heavy with a kind of morbid theatricality. As my assistants and I maneuvered it onto the truck, I noted the first anomaly. Through my thick work gloves, the frame felt unnaturally cold, a deep, cellular chill that had nothing to do with the dampness of the house. Back in the controlled climate of my workshop, the phenomenon persisted. While every other object from the estate quickly acclimated, the mirror maintained a thermal inertia that defied explanation. My infrared thermometer registered its surface as several degrees below the ambient room temperature, a physical impossibility for an object of its mass and material composition. I logged it as a curiosity and began the preliminary surface cleaning. It was then I saw the second anomaly. Old mirrors, particularly those made with a mercury tin amalgam, often have imperfections, distortions, waviness, a certain liquid depth to the reflection. This was different. As I moved my hand across the glass, my reflection did not move in perfect concert. There was a lag, a barely perceptible hesitation on the order of milliseconds, as if the light itself took a moment longer to travel and return. I stopped, moved my head from side to side, and watched the doppelganger in the glass follow a fraction of a second behind. It was a subtle, nauseating flaw in the fabric of physics, an optical stutter that made my own presence feel unstable. I attributed it to a unique combination of warping in the hand-poured glass and degradation of the silvering, a complex refractive problem that I would need to investigate further. The mirror from the Barrow estate presented two immediate and inexplicable physical anomalies: a persistent coldness and a fractional delay in its reflection. The work began, as it always does, with a solvent test on an inconspicuous corner to determine the nature of the grime. Decades of coal smoke and neglect had formed a stubborn, greasy film over the glass. I settled on a mixture of deionized water and a non-ionic surfactant, applied with soft cotton pads in a slow, methodical process. It is a meditative task, this patient removal of the past residue. You focus on the small square of glass before you, on the pressure of your hand, on the gradual emergence of clarity from beneath the filth. I was working on the upper quadrant when it happened. I leaned in to wipe away a particularly resistant smear, and my eyes automatically flicked up to my own reflection. My posture was mirrored perfectly, my movements tracked without the stutter I had noticed before. But the figure in the glass was not wearing my gray workshop apron. For the space of a single, frozen heartbeat, it was wearing a jacket of dark green Harris tweed, its herringbone pattern unmistakable. I knew that jacket. I had chosen it myself. It was the one my father had been buried in 5 years ago. My hands stopped moving. The squeak of cotton on glass ceased. I stared, but the image was already gone. My own apron was back in place, its canvas surface smudged with the day's labor. I straightened up, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that felt foreign and biological. I stepped back from the mirror, breathing deliberately. It was a textbook case of pareidolia, nothing more. My brain, primed by fatigue and the suggestive atmosphere of the object's provenance, had simply projected a pattern of profound personal significance onto a random play of light and shadow on the semi-cleaned, distorted surface. Grief is a powerful hallucinogen, and the mind's ability to create meaning from chaos is well documented. It was a momentary, explainable lapse in perception, and yet, when I returned to my work, I could not shake the feeling that the cold emanating from the glass was no longer a neutral physical property. While cleaning the mirror, I saw my reflection momentarily, dressed in my dead father's burial jacket, an occurrence I immediately dismissed as a trick of a tired and grieving mind. Rational explanations began to fray at the edges. The phenomenon was no longer a singular event, but a recurring intrusion, a persistent flaw in the logic of light. It was never the full jacket again. The manifestations grew more subtle, more intimate, and therefore more disturbing. I would glance up from my work, and the face looking back would have my father's eyes. Not just the color, but their specific, weary architecture, the slight droop of the left eyelid he developed after his stroke. A moment later, they would be mine again. Another time, as I frowned in concentration, the reflection's mouth tightened into my father's characteristic expression of thin-lipped disapproval, a look I had been on the receiving end of for most of my life. These were not apparitions, they were amendments to my own reflection, brief, hostile edits of my identity. My attempts to dismiss them as psychological artifacts became increasingly strained. I was well rested, my grief long settled into a manageable quiet. This was something else. Against every professional instinct, I set aside my conservation tools and contacted the solicitors. I presented my inquiry as a matter of due diligence, a need to understand the full provenance for archival purposes, a lie that felt flimsy even as I spoke it. They sent over the remaining estate papers, a few dusty deed boxes filled with the banal detritus of a family's decline, receipts, wills, and brittle correspondence. It was in a leather-bound journal kept by the wife of the last true occupant, Alistair Barrow, that I found it. Her entries, dated from the 1890s, began with loving concern for her husband after the death of his own father, and spiraled over the years into clinical despair. She wrote of Alistair's growing isolation, his neglect of the estate, and his obsessive new habit. He would stand for hours before the great pier glass in the drawing room, sometimes speaking to it in low tones. He says he sees Father in the reflection, one entry read, not as a ghost, but as a passenger in his own face. The final entries described a man utterly lost, gaunt and silent, who would no longer look at his own family, only at the man in the mirror. Breaking my professional code, I researched the mirror's history and discovered that its previous owner had also descended into madness while staring into the glass after the death of his father. Knowing the history did not arm me against it. It only gave the phenomenon a narrative. The transient superimpositions ceased. The flicker became a fixture. Now when I looked into the glass, the face that looked back was consistently and completely my father's. It wore my clothes, it stood in my workshop, it moved when I moved. But the face, from the hairline to the jaw, was his. It had settled over my own features like a permanent, translucent mask. My rational mind, desperate for an anchor, tried to categorize the experience as a form of complex, projective delusion, a complete psychological break. Yet I continued my work with the same precision as always. My hands were steady. My chemical mixtures were exact. My sanity, by every professional metric, was intact. The horror was not in the vision itself, but in the silent interaction that began. There was no conversation. The glass was silent. But there was a dialogue, a cruel and relentless pantomime staged in the space between my action and the reflection's reaction. When I successfully repaired a piece of the intricate gilt frame, a task requiring immense skill, the face in the mirror would not smile. Its lips would press together in that familiar, thin line that meant adequate, but not impressive. When a tool slipped, scarring the wood I was treating, the reflection's eyes would close for a moment, and its head would give a slow, minute shake of profound, weary exasperation. It was a perfect, soul-flaying reenactment of every workshop lesson from my childhood. The entity in the mirror had access to a curated library of my father's signature expressions of disapproval, and it deployed them with surgical precision. It was a psychological vivisection, using my own unresolved grief as the scalpel. The face in the mirror became a constant, silent judge, using my father's expressions to enact a pantomime of disappointment in response to my every move. A lifetime of empirical discipline demanded that I subject the phenomenon to a battery of controlled tests. A problem, no matter how bizarre, is merely a set of unknown variables. My first hypothesis was that the effect was a complex illusion contingent on specific lighting conditions. I therefore spent an entire day systematically altering the workshop's illumination. I replaced my neutral, full-spectrum fluorescent tubes with warm, incandescent bulbs, then with the harsh blue-white glare of halogen work lamps. I moved light sources around the object, changing the angle of incidence, creating hard shadows and then soft, diffuse light. The man in the mirror was indifferent to these efforts. His borrowed face stared back, immutable, its weary disappointment unchanged by wattage or color temperature. My second hypothesis centered on ocular fatigue or some neurological trick of my own perception. To test this, I introduced intermediaries. I photographed the mirror with a high-resolution digital camera. On the camera's display screen, my father's face looked back at me, pixel for pixel. I recorded video and watched on playback as the reflection perfectly mimicked my movements, its features an unwavering mask of my father's. The phenomenon was not in my eye, it was objectively present, capable of being captured and reproduced by a machine. The final and most critical test was the introduction of a control group. I brought two other mirrors into the workshop, a small, modern shaving mirror with perfect flatness, and another large 18th century looking glass I was restoring. Propped beside the Barrow mirror, they formed a triptych of my reflection. In the two control mirrors, I saw myself, Elias Thorne, age 53, a man showing the strain of his recent experience, his face pale and drawn. But in the center panel, the Barrow mirror, my father stood, a silent, spectral observer, flanked by my true self. The experiment was conclusive. The anomaly was intrinsic to that specific object. Science had failed. My entire professional methodology was useless. In a final act of desperation, I took a heavy canvas drop cloth and threw it over the mirror. The silence in the workshop became instantly heavier, the cold emanating from the corner now a muffled, brooding presence. But I could not work. My focus was gone, shattered by an overwhelming, magnetic awareness of the shrouded object. The simple act of not looking became an active, exhausting struggle. An irrational but powerful conviction took hold, that averting my gaze was a form of surrender, an admission that the silent, judging entity behind the cloth had won. My own will was no longer entirely my own. After less than an hour, my hands shaking, I pulled the cloth away. Every rational experiment designed to debunk the reflection failed, and a powerful compulsion prevented me from simply covering the mirror and looking away. I returned to the deed boxes from the Barrow estate, convinced I had overlooked something in the wife's journal, some detail that would reframe the phenomenon within the known laws of psychology. Buried at the bottom of a stack of brittle invoices, I found it, a single, folded sheet of paper, separate from the bound journal. Its script, a spidery, frantic scrawl, completely unlike the woman's measured hand. It was an unsent letter from Alistair Barrow himself, dated mere days before his death, addressed to no one. It was not the writing of a man lost to delusion, but of one who had achieved a final, terrible clarity. He wrote that the physicians were wrong, that his condition was not an ailment of the mind. He insisted that the figure in the glass was not his father's spirit returned to haunt him. A ghost, he wrote, is an echo of a life once lived. This is an echo of a life that was never there at all. He described the entity not as a presence, but as a perfect and absolute absence, a void that had learned to counterfeit a human face. He called it a hunger that wears a familiar face, a parasite that anchored itself to his grief. It does not speak, he scrawled, the pen having dug deep into the paper, but it feeds. It shows me my father's disappointment, and it grows stronger on the sorrow this performance extracts from me. It is a hollow thing, and it means to make me hollow too. In that moment, the entire horrifying architecture of the situation was revealed to me. I had been making a fundamental category error. I was not being haunted by my father. My grief had not summoned his spirit. My grief had simply painted a target on my back for something that had been waiting patiently in the cold glass. The entity was not personal. It had no history, no tragedy of its own. It was a predator, pure and simple, and its camouflage was the face of the dead. The subtle emotional manipulations, the silent theater of disapproval, these were not the lingering resentments of a troubled father-son relationship. They were the calculated, adaptive hunting techniques of a thing that consumed sorrow. I looked up from the letter, across the workshop to the mirror. The face was still my father's, but now I saw it for what it was. A mask, flawlessly rendered, but utterly empty, worn by a patient, silent hunger. Alistair Barrow's final letter revealed the entity in the mirror was not a ghost, but a predatory void that mimics the form of the dead to feed on the grief of the living. To destroy the object would have been a simple matter. A hammer, a moment of violence, and the thing would be a pile of glittering shards. It would also have been a complete negation of my entire life's work, a betrayal of the core principle by which I have always defined myself, that our duty is to preserve, not to judge. I am a conservator. I do not get to choose which pieces of history survive based on the comfort they afford me. And so, with a grim and hollow sense of professional obligation, I began the final stage of the restoration. I applied the microcrystalline wax to the newly consolidated gilt frame, working it into the crevices of the serpentine leaves with a soft brush. My movements were precise, economical, honed by decades of practice. I was on autopilot, my hands performing the familiar ritual while my mind was a silent, screaming void. With a clean cloth, I began to buff the frame to a soft luster, and with every pass of the cloth, I had to look at the glass to check my work. He was still there, the silent passenger, wearing my father's face. But as I worked, he watched me with an expression that was no longer just disappointment. There was a new quality in his eyes, a flicker of something like satisfaction. The commission was almost complete. The object was stabilized, its integrity secured for another century. I applied the last touch of adhesive to a loose shard of the silvering on the back, cataloged my work in the logbook, and prepared the final invoice. My duty was done. I stood back for one final inspection. I saw my own face first, or what was left of it. It was thin, sallow, the eyes sunk deep into their sockets, but the mask was gone. I was myself again in the reflection, and for a wild, soaring moment, I thought it was over. Then I saw him. He was standing just behind my right shoulder, a distinct and separate figure within the mirror-S frame. He was wearing the tweed jacket, his face was my father's, and he was looking directly at me with an expression of quiet, absolute ownership. The void was no longer a mask, it was a companion. I stepped away from the Barrow mirror and turned to catch my reflection in the dark glass of my chemical cabinet. There, faint but unmistakable, was my own tired face, and just behind my shoulder, the shadowy outline of the man in the tweed jacket. The entity had completed its work, preserving the mirror and in doing so, ensuring the echo was no longer confined to the object, but was now a permanent internal fixture of his own reflection. The Barrow mirror ultimately teaches a horrifying lesson. Some objects do not just decay, they become vessels for a hunger that feeds on human sorrow. Elias Thorne began his work believing history was merely a set of chemical reactions, a problem to be solved with solvents and skill. He finished it by discovering that his own grief had made him a permanent part of the object's predatory legacy, an unbroken reflection he can never look away from. If you appreciate these explorations into the unsettling, please consider supporting the Silent Whispers channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these stories. To continue the discussion, we'd like to ask, what inherited gesture or expression from a loved one would be the most terrifying to see looking back at you from your own reflection? Thank you for listening. Until next time, be careful what you keep. We'll return to explore the quiet dread of the lonely highways and the story of a forgotten audio diary whose owner is still recording.